Hey, what up squad, it's your boy K-Flow, and in this video I'm going to show you how to replace the rear wheel bearings on the Toyota Tacoma. Now let's get this thing started. If you're new to this channel makes in-depth Toyota Tacoma DIY tutorials. So smash that like and subscribe button, baby. Do it now, guys. Now all the materials and tools that I use in this video will be on my Amazon page. So make sure you check that out at amazon.kflow-crib.com. Now let's get to the garage. So here's the current setup, guys. I have both wheels chalked up in the front, and the truck is jacked up on the one side where we're going to be replacing the rear wheel bearing. This way, it keeps most of the fluid inside the differential instead of spilling out the side. I also have a 2x4 block stepping on the brake pedal. This is a manual, so that's the clutch. This way, it prevents the fluid from the reservoir, and that's the brake fluid, from coming out of the brake system when we do open up the brake system to remove that rear axle. I also do have the battery disconnected so that we don't kill the batteries while we're pressing on the brakes. And at this point we can release the rear brakes. Now all the nuts as well as the brake lines have been soaking in PB Blaster. So now let's remove this rear wheel using a 21mm socket. Now I do have spacers on this truck, so if you have them, you should also remove them. At this point we could also remove this drum covering the hub. So for this, I'm going to try to use a pry bar and hammer the lip on the drum outwards. So that didn't work out too well, guys. It looks like this drum is pretty much seized on there. So I went out and got some M8 by 1.25 bolts to drive into the threaded holes on the drum so that we can at least pull this thing from the inside. So first I'm going to clear out those threaded holes with an air gun. And I'm going to use some anti-seize on those threads to help these bolts slip in easier in there. So the threads on these bolts pretty much just bottomed out. These were the only ones available at the hardware store. So I'm gonna use the pry bar and the hammer the rest of the way. There we go. So we will have to undo this entire rear brake shoe assembly. So we'll first remove the 4 springs. There's one spring there, second spring there, third spring there, and the 4th spring there. We'll use some needle nose vice grips to pretty much help remove those things. Now we should be able to remove these locking springs. I'm going to be using the same needle nose pliers to push it in and twist it. So this is basically a slotted piece, and this pin has a flat where it goes in only one way and it's twisted 90 degrees to stay in place. And we'll have to do the same thing on this other brake shoe. Now we will have to remove this cable from this bracket here. And all it is, it's basically like a captive cable where there's a locking piece at the end. And let's undo this right now so you guys can see it. So you just pull this side up and then it slips right off, just like that. Now it will be a good idea to set all these brake parts aside for now. You don't have to disassemble the rear shoe. You can keep it as is and just make sure you orient all those springs in the same way that they came off of. Just like this upper piece here, I've kept that together so it'll be easier for reassembly. Now on this e-brake, there's going to be these two 10mm bolts that we'll have to undo so that we can pull this whole e-brake cable away from this dust shield here in the back. It looks like the bracket is a little seized in the back, so I'm going to use this flathead screwdriver to help in removing it. That's all it is, guys. Now it would be a good idea to also feed these screws back where they came from temporarily so that it's easy to figure out which bolts go where. Just like that, guys. Now let's undo this ABS sensor using a 10mm socket and a flathead screwdriver to slowly pry it from that wheel bearing. Again, I already had this soaked with PB Blaster for at least an hour. There we go. Didn't break this time, guys. Now let's undo this brake line bracket using a 12mm socket. And now we can undo this brake line here as well as this bleeder valve. There will be some brake fluid that will leak out, so just make sure you have a catch underneath or a rag to catch the little bit of brake fluid that comes out. And we will be using a 10mm line wrench to undo both of them. So now let's use a 14mm wrench to remove the 4 nuts holding this hub assembly. So now this whole axle and hub assembly should just slip right out. So she's a little bit seized on there, so I'm going to use a 2x4 with a hammer to pretty much break that rust that's preventing it from breaking loose. Now if there's any brake fluid that ends up spilling on the axle housing, just make sure you wipe that off so it doesn't peel off any paint. So now we will be replacing this O-ring here, so we can remove that. And we are also going to be replacing this axle seal here, and we can remove that using a seal puller tool. So now just be careful when you use this tool, guys. You don't want to mar up the inside of that axle housing. You want to get this tip right behind the seal itself. And it's good to just put your finger right underneath there to get the lip to protrude out a little bit, and then just put the hook right behind that lip so that you know that it's only touching the metal. So now I'm just hammering the opposite side. And that's it, guys. This assembly is pretty much complete at this point. Alright guys, so now we'll have to remove the retaining ring right there. So here we'll use a retaining ring expander tool to try to remove that retaining ring. There she is, guys. So we are going to need a few specialty tools, guys, starting with this one. This one is an axle bearing puller tool, and I'll have the link in my Amazon page, so you can check that out, amazon.kflow-crib.com. we are also going to need a shop press, and you'll see why. As well as this knife style bearing puller tool and a few carriage bolts. These carriage bolts I'll put in the dimensions right now. So for this axle bearing puller tool, I did actually have to make a modification so that this fits on my shop press. This part here is what goes onto the hub side of the axle, and that part there is what slides underneath the shop press from the bottom, so I can put it underneath, twist it 90 degrees so that the shop press can push down on the axle. I'll show you that so you have a better idea of what goes on. So there's the axle that we pulled from the truck. Now let's slide that tubular tool over until we match the holes to those studs. And now we can put in the nuts right behind there so that the tool is secured to the hub assembly. So there's the tool, guys, fully installed on the hub assembly. So as I mentioned, I did have to plasma cut this. You can probably use an angle grinder, but it will definitely take forever as this thing is definitely about a ½ inch thick. So this flange has to fit in the gap here, and then you push it from underneath and then twist it 90 degrees so that this point of the flange, the shoulder of the flange, rests on this truss of the shop press. And I'll show you that now. I'll also put this away for now because we don't need this until a little bit later. So I did raise up this truss just another notch so that the press itself is closer to the end of that axle. And I did lay down some cardboard underneath, because what's going to happen is the axle will be pushed out and the hub assembly part of it will be left behind, and this whole thing will kind of slam down, and just throw in some cardboard underneath will pretty much cushion the blow. There it is, guys, popped right out and slid right onto this box. Now let's take this whole assembly right out. So now let's remove the tool from the hub assembly, and now we'll use that same ratcheting 14mm wrench. There we go, guys. And we make sure we don't lose these two pieces. It would be good to keep these three pieces together for now. This was the retaining ring that was removed off of the drive shaft. Alright guys, now we will have to knock these studs in. So I'm gonna put this 2x4 right underneath here, just like that. And I gotta make sure that there's space in between the end of the stud to the table. So I'm going to put this nut right on the stud and then just hammer it right through. Just like that, guys. Now we'll just have to do that 3 more times. Now this inner race might come out the top, but we don't need this, so we can just put it to the side right now. Now this whole wheel bearing assembly we'll have to put back on the press. We'll actually have to remove this wheel bearing portion off. So I'll show you how to do that now. We're also going to need this master ball joint service kit. This one I rented from my local auto parts store for free. Inside the kit we can grab this piece here or anything that fits right over the hub assembly. I'll show you how it's gonna fit right now. So that piece goes right over the hub assembly like that. And right now this whole dust shield and hub assembly is floating right on 2x4s. Because what we're gonna want to do is pretty much push this hub assembly right through this dust shield, using that tool to push this whole thing down. So that pretty much separates the dust shield from this wheel bearing assembly. So as you saw earlier, this is the inner race. We'll hold on to this one for now, and I'll show you why a little bit later in this video. If this piece is still stuck on here, you'll actually have another inner race right on the axle itself, and we'll also have to pull that, so I'll show you that now. So this is the inner race of the wheel bearing assembly, guys. As you can see, this is going to be two pieces, one for the inner, one for the outer. And this is basically what this is. So this slid over the opposite side from the top, and this is the inner race more closer to the outside of the vehicle. So we'll also have to pull that using this bearing puller tool. So this will have to close on both sides of this inner race, one on each side, and then we'll have to pull it upwards so this gets removed from the shaft. So what we're gonna have to do is wrap this clamshell around here, and I'm gonna have the bolts protrude from the opposite end, just like that. And these are just carriage bolts that I picked up from Lowe's. Now we'll have to try to reinstall that tool back onto the shaft. And this whole thing we'll put back on the press so that we can push on the drive shaft to remove this inner race. So here's the bearing separator. I rented from AutoZone as well. So here's the bearing race after we use the press to remove it. As you can see, there's this outer ring here that will come off this inner portion of the race. So we'll save this for later because we'll actually use this as a punch to push in the new seal. And this seal here pretty much came off of this as well. So we can trash this, but we'll keep this. And here's the axle, guys. We'll definitely have to clean all of this internal portion of the axle before we reassemble it. So now that we have this axle bare, let's clean it up with a wire brush and some brake cleaner. And now we'll also clean up this dust shield. Gotta be careful with this rubber piece here. We don't want to touch that with brake cleaner. So here's the new wheel bearing, guys. We do have to make sure that we orient this thing properly on both the driver's side and the passenger side, because each one is unique to that position. There is a big difference between the driver's side wheel bearing and the passenger side wheel bearing. These threaded holes here, it's going to be on the opposite side. So this one on the passenger side, the threaded hole that you see there is on the left hand side, as you see here with the seal oriented upwards. And on the driver's side, the threaded hole is on this side. So really make sure you're double checking and triple checking your work, because once you press it in, can't take it out without breaking it. So at this point, guys, let's put some anti-seize around this outer lip here, around this shoulder, which this dust shield will ride on. So you can see like that. So let's do that right now. And we can put the dust shield on just like that. So this assembly will place on a 2x4 for now. These studs that we have earlier, let's prep them up and clean them up. Going to be using a wire brush to get rid of the crud between the threads. Now we can take these studs and put them back to their proper positions. You can use a hammer to tap them in. These things are still gonna be semi-loose on there, so it'll be good to thread in the nuts behind so they don't fall out. Just finger tight for now. So that's what it looks like right now, guys. As you can see, it's still pretty loose on there. But we'll keep it like that before we do the final assembly. So here's the washer, the retainer, and this retaining ring. Let's also clean that up with a little bit of brake cleaner on a rag to remove all that excess grease. So here's the reassembly, guys. Here's our axle. This axle will be sitting on the bottom, and this wheel bearing assembly will be sliding around the top. We'll be pressing that in, and this washer then sets on top, and this retainer and this retaining ring will go over the whole thing. So from our master ball joint service kit, we'll actually need to use one of these cylinders, and luckily the smallest one here is just big enough to fit right over the shaft. So let's fit that now. It fits all the way through to the shoulder without binding up, as you see. And this same thing is also small enough where it can push down on this retainer here. So we'll have to use this to push down on the retainer. And this retainer has to be pushed all the way down past this notch on the drive shaft. So just a quick recap, guys. This axle gets fed through the bottom. This washer goes on top. This retainer goes on top of the washer. And we push down on the whole thing until we have enough clearance to see this notch. Then we could drive down a retaining ring. Now let's prepare all these surfaces, guys. So for the axle itself, we'll put some wheel bearing grease here and here, and parts right above this notch here. This allows the reassembly to get a little bit easier, as well as work as a corrosion preventative coating. And we'll also do the same thing on this wheel bearing. We'll definitely also want to grease this inner portion of the seal. I know exactly what you're thinking about, you dirty bastards. Oh yeah, get it all in there. Now this whole thing will slide right over the shaft, just partially, because we will need to press these two pieces in. So now let's take it to the press. So at this point, guys, we'll feed the washer, retainer, and the cylinder from the bottom and get everything set up that way. So there it is, guys. These are the press plates that the press came with. There's the cylinder, the retainer, the washer is behind it, and then here is our wheel bearing. And there's the axle itself. We will have to press this whole thing down until we can fit the retaining ring, which I have right here. So now let's get to the pressing. Now I am going to be using a socket just small enough to fit right on the center of that axle. So now would be a good time to double check the fit of this retaining ring. So I'm going to lift it slightly and try to get the retaining ring right in the notch just from the side. And then if it fits through, then I'll pull this whole thing off. Still can't see the notch yet, guys, so I'm gonna readjust this press so it's a little bit higher and then press it a little bit more. Oh yeah, now she fits. So I'll take it off and I'll show you what I mean. So as you can see here, guys, there's a notch there. This is the retaining ring. I'm pushing it through, and this can easily go through that notch. So now I'll push it from the top so that this whole thing gets set in place. So now I'll slide the retaining ring from the top and use the same cylinder to push the retaining ring all the way down to that notch. Now I did also put some wheel bearing grease on this retaining ring. There we go, guys. Now that's seated in there properly. It'd be good to go around with a screwdriver and just push it in to double check that it's seated right on there. Oh yeah, she's not going anywhere, guys. Now let's prep up the axle housing, guys. We'll clean up this outer surface with some brake cleaner and a rag, and we'll also clean up the same thing on the inner surface here. We can put some wheel bearing grease on this inner surface here to help the seal slide in, and we'll put anti-seize on the outside here. As I mentioned before, we will be using this inner race to help punch in this seal onto the inside of this axle housing. And we can also put some wheel bearing grease on the inner side of this oil seal. And last but not least, we'll install a new O-ring. Just like that, guys. So at this point, guys, we'll reinstall the hub assembly back on here. But before we do that, we do have to remove those 4 nuts. You have to be really careful when you're doing this, guys. You don't want to mess up that seal. Might have to rotate a little bit for it to get pushed in. Alright, guys, now we could install those 14mm nuts and torque them down to 27 foot-pounds. And make sure we torque them down in a cross pattern. So the studs in the back might follow, and all you have to do is use needle nose pliers to prevent them from rotating, and then they'll eventually set. Alrighty, guys, now let's reinstall those brake lines. Let's make sure we also put some anti-seize on these brake lines so they don't seize up next time. This one I am going to keep loose for now because we are going to have to bleed the system. Now we can also install the ABS sensor. Now let's clean the crud off of that sensor using a rag. Now we can also reinstall this brake line bracket bolt, and we use a 12mm socket and torque it down to 15 foot-pounds. Alrighty, guys, now let's feed that e-brake cable through this hole and install the 2 10mm bolts right behind it. So for this shoe that we removed earlier, we'll have to reattach this cable, and in order to do so, it's pretty quick and straightforward. Here is the back side of the shoe. So this is the front, this is the back. We'll take that back side, and all it is basically a hook. So we'll hook it in from the back. I'll turn it around so you guys can see it better. Hook it in from the back, just like that. See? And we'll let this hang out for now. Now I'm gonna put a little bit of brake caliper grease on these mating surfaces here. And we'll put the retaining pin from the back. It has to go in through the back just like that. and the brake shoe goes in the front. And I'll show you how that assembles. So we'll pull this out, leave it in there partially. We'll take the brake shoe that we have hanging, just like that. You put the pin in from the back, like so. Put the retaining spring in from the front. We use our needle nose pliers to get the retaining cap through. And twist, just like that, guys. Now we do have to make sure the top of the shoe is into this brake expander cylinder that you see here, and the spring and that pusher assembly is hanging out just like that into the opposite side. And underneath here you'll see that the e-brake cable is riding right there. There's another shot from the bottom. So now we could put in this forward shoe, guys. Make sure this piece stays on here, and this literally just rides on this peg here. I'll take this spring off for now, install that later. So this literally rides on this peg here. We'll install this front shoe. Grease up the other side, guys. Put some brake caliper grease on these bearing surfaces. Reinstall the front shoe. We'll match this little bracket underneath first. We'll slide it in, and then we'll put the retaining pin and spring. Just like before, guys, we gotta make sure we line up the tip of the brake shoe into that cylinder. We also gotta make sure that this fork piece is going into that first 90-degree notch. This is a spring that we'll be pulling later. You gotta make sure this bracket is riding properly here. And that long bracket, we gotta make sure that that rides here. So you can see this is part of the rear brake shoe. This rides into that bracket with a little bit of a notch over here. Just like that, guys. So now let's install the spring on this swing bracket here and to the shoe. So it's supposed to hang like that, going into the shoe like that. There's a better look, guys. Let's pull this spring to the front shoe. Yeah, we gotta make sure that this part of the assembly is lined up properly, where this bracket is behind this fork going into the notch on the brake shoe, so that we can get this spring to go into the hole here. First we'll put this spring in, then this spring, and then the bottom two springs. Let's install these lower springs. Let's start with this spring up here, which will ride on that notch. We pull it back to this notch here. We'll use some needle nose pliers to help us. Now we can install this small spring here. Just like that. Alrighty, guys, now let's clean this whole thing up with a wire brush and use some anti-seize on this bearing surface so that we don't have to deal with the stuff seizing up again. And now we can also reinstall the brake drum. Now I can brush off all the dirt on all these surfaces so that my spacer doesn't seize up either. Now I do have spacers, guys, so I'm going to be putting red Loctite on these before torquing them down. Now I'm going to be pulling the e-brake, guys, in order to lock this so that I can torque it down to 95 foot-pounds. So that's pretty much it for the installation, guys. The only thing left to do now would be to reinstall this wheel, top off the rear differential fluid just to make sure that we have enough fluid in there, and also bleed the brakes. Now those details will be in a separate video, and I'll link them in the description below. So for those of you guys who are curious as to where the new encoder is, that new encoder is actually built into the new wheel bearing assembly. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. And again, make sure you smash that like, subscribe, and hit that bell too while you're at it. Until next time, peace.